Well, a very good morning, everyone, to this Atticus Partners seminar. This is, of course, about the spending review, the very dramatic announcements made by Rachel Reeves last week, the 2025 spending review, a webinar briefing, and I'm delighted to be here. I am an Atticus Partners Senior Counsel. I'm also a presenter on Talk and Times Radio. I'm a journalist. And with me this morning, thank you so much to our panellists, James Frith, who is the Labour MP for Bury North, Joe Twyman, who's the co-founder and director of Deltapoll, one of the biggest polling companies in this country, and Dr. Seamus Nevin, who's chief economist at Make UK. Thank you so much to them for taking part. We'll go right through until 9:55 and then let you go. I know some people will have meetings and other Zooms at 10 o'clock. So we'll go through to 9:55. If you have questions, please put them in the questions box. What's going to happen is that you'll see me looking down because my colleagues at Atticus are going to send the questions to me on WhatsApp. I'm going to read them out. But what I'd like to do is start with each panelist in turn. What was your initial reaction to the spending review? Did the government achieve what it wanted to? Let's start with the economist in Dr. Seamus Nevin.
Morning, folks. I think my initial reaction to the spending review was that we didn't expect a huge amount from for the business community. This was about public sector spending, and 40 pence in every pound of government spending is covered by the spending review. But it does set out the fiscal framework that we can expect to underpin the government's future decisions. And that, in that sense, there was a lot of light shed on just how narrow the fiscal envelope is for the government when it comes to things like the industrial strategy, which we are expecting probably next week, and the further announcements, the sector deals, and the skills plan and other aspects of the kind of economic agenda and the growth agenda that this government will be setting out over the coming weeks. I think quite clearly, when we look at the figures, obviously defence and health were the two big winners, but there's really a very narrow wedge of increases even there. And given all of the other geopolitical and economic constraints coming, I think it's probably going to be a very challenging year ahead for Rachel Reeves if she is to stick to her fiscal rules. So there's a lot of insight there, but also I think a lot of challenges are quite clear too.
James Frith, from Labour's perspective, I'm sure that many Labour MPs would say this is all wonderful. Rachel Reeves is such a marvellous human being and wonderful, marvellous saviour of the nation. I know you have critical thinking and independent thoughts, as well as loyalty to the Labour Party. So why don't you combine those two and give us your thoughts on this?
You've got psychologists being added to your description, Peter, of your skills.
No, look, really good. It's all psychology. That's all it is.
Really good to be with you all this morning. Look, you're right. It's an important moment in the chamber. The enthusiasm was very real from the backbenchers. The confrontation is very real from the opposition. But Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor, has to speak to the nation and set out those priorities for the next 4 years within the spending envelope that she's determined from the budget last year. A budget, obviously, that began with an assessment of the wreckage we inherited after 14 years of the Tories. There was a lot of reasons to be positive and upbeat, of course. I don't disagree with Seamus' assessment that the fiscal situation continues to be tight and look tight. But I think the embracing of, for example, defence as a priority and the crucial interventionist nature of this government and it choosing to spend the money on its priorities in this country where possible is a real boost to the towns and the companies that will, as a result, get more contracts through the government spending more on defence. And of course, we know from the general election last year that health is the number one concern, and the extra 26 billion pounds a year that is being raised as a result of the rise in national insurance for employers means that there is more money to inject into both capital spend for our NHS, things like scanners to get equipment to regional hospitals to get the bumps and lumps of the people waiting in line for ages to get their assessments or diagnosis or operations. And these are the very real day-to-day challenges that the government is trying to set out to combat. Final point, all of this is well and good, but people need to feel the experiences changing in everyday life. So I don't yet think that will have permeated the consciousness of everyday men and women across the country, because the money needs to get to the places, the priorities, and begin to be delivered.
And that is exactly what Rachel Reeves says in terms of the feeling, the sensation that Labour is helping in some way, that the government is helping people in the cost of living crisis with all the troubles that they're having. Joe Twyman, really no better man to take with his finger on the pulse of the nation. What is your assessment of how the spending review has gone down, Joe?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that the average person in the street, and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, really isn't paying too much attention to the detail of the spending review, the precise numbers, the precise areas. They may have a broad idea at best of what's going on, but instead it's about the narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other around the economy that will be most important. And yes, things like the spending review and the other events that have been mentioned feed into this, but so do things such as the announcement on growth or lack thereof that came so soon after the spending review, or today's figures on inflation remaining unchanged. All of these go into the pot, if you like, for allowing the general public to make an assessment about the direction of travel for the economy. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And that can be perceived at the national level. Is the country's economy improving? And then it can be viewed in terms of people's own financial circumstances. Are the economic circumstances of my household getting better or worse? Those are all the kind of questions that that people seek to answer. And as I say, events like this feed into that. Going into this, it was not a great position for the government. It could be worse. When we asked people which party was best to deal with the cost of living crisis, which remains by some distance the most important issue facing the country, both in terms of the country as a whole and people and their families. And when we asked people who was best to deal with that, Labour did come top. That's the good news, on 23%, and that's where the bad news begins. The Conservatives were on 22%, Reform on 20%. So in statistical terms, a three-way tie. On top of that, you had more than 1 in 5 people saying that they don't know, and I think that is a key, if you like, context for all of this discussion. There is a sizable minority of people in this country who simply don't know which party is best to deal with the economy.
Sorry to interrupt you, Joe, but I just wonder with that don't know aspect of things, how does that compare with recent political years? Because of course, really since 2014, we've had very binary things, people perhaps being engaged with some aspect of politics, whether it's the Scottish referendum, whether it's Brexit, whatever it is, maybe a little bit more than they have been. Is that don't know getting larger? Is the apathy getting larger, do you think?
Well, whether it's apathy or not depends on your interpretation, but
Sure,
definitely the figure of don't know is growing, and part of that is a reflection of the fact that our political system now is dominated, at least in terms of the media and the coverage, dominated by 3 parties, and we see that in the polls as well. But if you're being generous to Labour, or indeed any of the parties, you could say, well, this represents an opportunity. These people simply are unsure about which of the parties is best to deliver, and it represents an opportunity to win those people over. But if you're being, I would say, more realistic, you could say it's simply a reflection of the fact that that the government is not seen as providing the answers, and neither are any of the other parties. But the problem that all of the parties face is that actually there isn't an overwhelming consensus on the way to move forward. 36% of people, so just over a third, believe that we should keep taxes and spending at the level they are at the moment. But then a further third, just below that, 34%, believe that increases should be made in terms of spending and taxation. So very equal proportions there across different divides. And around 1 in 7 believes that taxes should be cut. But that's true across the political spectrum. It's not the case that Labour supporters overwhelmingly favour increases or Conservative supporters overwhelmingly favour tax cuts. All the party's supporters are divided over the way to move forward. And so that presents a difficulty for any political party.
Thank you to everybody who is on this Zoom. This is Atticus Partners Spending Review 2025 webinar briefing. If you've thoughts or questions for our panelists, please do add them in the question section and I'll read them out and ask our panelists. I have some more questions of my own. I want to go first to Dr. Seamus Nevin, the Chief Economist at Make UK. Just for those who have joined us in the last few minutes, maybe not just at the start, I find giving people's potted CV is maybe a little better after the first question. Just some people miss the start of Zooms. So Seamus is Chief Economist for Make UK, who's formerly EEF. Prior to joining EEF, Seamus was Head of Policy Research at the Institute of Directors. He served as a member of Chancellor George Osborne's National Living Wage Advisory Group. He's a co-founder and chair of the Irish and Westminster Network and an associate faculty member at the University of Oxford. Joe Twyman is co-founder and director of Delta Poll, public opinion consultancy. He was head of political and social research at YouGov and served as a director since its creation in 2000. He's credited, quite rightly, for building YouGov's online research operation. He's well regarded as one of Britain's best known and most respected political pollsters. And of course, we have James Frith with us as well, the Labour MP for Bury North. He was elected last year. Prior to this, he was MP for Bury North from 17 to 19. And before entering Parliament, James worked as a campaign and communications manager for the Labour Party, including during the 2005 general election for Ruth Kelly. She was Secretary of State for Education. He also served on Bury Council for 4 years, and whilst in Parliament in his first term, he was a member of the Education Select Committee, and he's now a member of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. He joined that in October last. I want to keep with the same order, if that's okay. Start with Seamus, then James, then Joe. So, Dr. Seamus Nevin, it's clear the government's fiscal position still very challenging. They're under immense pressure to improve public services while paying for big ticket items such as the winter fuel allowance, and the public has lost some patience, as Joe has outlined there. Does this spending review put the government in a position to deliver on the public's expectations, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think the more one looks at last week's spending review, the more one appreciates the challenges to the economy and that the government is facing. Health and defence were the two clear beneficiaries, but even there's a little bit of uncertainty. So that the health budget has been increased to 3.6%, which is obviously a positive move for the NHS. But when you look, or to 3% rather, but when you look at the kind of real-term outcomes for health spending, it increases by about 3.6% per annum, and in previous periods where waiting lists have had to be reduced, it's taken about 5 to 6% spending to cut that list. So it's quite likely more money will be needed if those outcomes that the government has set out are to be achieved. At the same side, on defence, obviously a very positive uptick in defence spending, and that will have significant spillover into the civilian economy. There are 18,000 manufacturing companies in the UK defence supply chain, supplying everything from food and drink to oils and paints. So, you know, lots of benefits and spillover into the civilian side of the economy and into local communities. But even just a 3% uptick in defence spending isn't in line with what, for example, President Donald Trump is asking of all NATO members. So there's still a lot of demands, and that's without even considering the domestic front of Labour voters wanting more spending on social welfare, more spending on infrastructure, more spending on housing, etc. And all of that on the back of a very tight and demanding autumn statement last year, and significant tax increases, particularly when it comes to employers' national insurance. So there's quite a lot, I think, still to play for over the coming year. And when you look also at things like the situation in the Middle East right now, there's potential disruption coming from overseas that could really put a spanner in the works in terms of the government's objectives to achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7. So for all the talk of having stabilized the economy, there are still, I think, some very tough choices ahead, and we'll have to look to the budget later this year to see what those choices will be.
James Frith?
Could you remind me the question, Peter, please?
Certainly,
Sorry.
yes. It's talking about the government's position fiscally still being very challenging. They're under a lot of pressure to improve public services. Some would argue, of course, that the waiting list, there has been some improvement there. West Streeting seems to be making some inroads there. They've got to pay for big ticket items, the U-turn on the winter fuel allowance, for example. Public patience is one of the elements I asked about. I just wonder, does the spending review put the government in a position to deliver the public's expectations, do you think?
It's a good question. Look, I think the turning anything around, if you were to become the new chief of an organization, you would expect longer than the first year to turn around or to change the fortunes of something that had been run by someone else for 14 years. And that's the situation we're at the moment. Joe's description of the undecided voter, I'm relaxed about. I think that is both the challenge and the opportunity. I think at this stage in the Parliament, the don't know voter is more that doesn't need to decide voter, and they don't need to decide. They're being asked a question that won't be put to them, and the challenge is to ensure they've every reason to firm up to Labour at the next time of asking. And I think some of the first year in office, the Labour government hasn't been as front-footed in telling its story as it might have been. And I think the spending review was an opportunity to retake that, to reframe.
Why is that, do you think, James? Do you think they got distracted, or the political circumstance? Why didn't they tell their story as much as they could have?
Possibly a degree of match fitness. I think both the country and the party were not used to governing, and I think the intensity of office and the keenness to, if you like, get their heads down and crack on may have meant the opportunity cost of that they didn't look up the horizon, take an assessment of what people might be thinking or feeling as a result of early actions. But I think this is an opportunity for the Chancellor. This was an opportunity for the Chancellor to reset some of that storytelling. She talked a lot in her speech about the choices that she makes. And again, Seamus, enjoyed hearing your bio, Seamus. And would agree with your assessment that actually, despite a tight fiscal framework, there are still choices. You know, the language of priorities is what determines government. And so Rachel Reeves' opportunity to stand up and talk in full appreciation of the need to increase defence spending that hadn't increased since the last Labour government, as well as the commitment to homes and the building of new homes, and to power that radical change in the towns and regions of the country that require the new homes that we need.
Talking about match fitness, Joe, does the government find itself in a position because of the spending review to deliver its commitments, do you think, or do the many problems continue? What's your view on this?
Firstly, I would agree with James that where the situation is now, because polling is only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the specific time, is not necessarily cause for concern, because we, along with all other pollsters, ask if there were a general election tomorrow, which party would you vote for? And of course, the people responding to the survey know, or at least most of them will know, that there isn't a general election tomorrow. There are, we assume, 4 years until the next election, and a lot can happen in that time, both good and bad. I think the difficulty that the government face on this is the fact that it's not just about the spending that's made, it's about people's perception. And so people have to actually feel that their economic situation is improving as a result of the government's actions. And that is a difficult task to pull off in what are difficult economic circumstances. And so really the key question over the next 4 years will be the degree to which all of these announcements, every year's budgets, the spring and autumn statements, the spending reviews, but also all of the economic factors around growth and inflation. As I said in my introduction, the degree to which all of those feed into a narrative that people will then take into the voting booth with them, that will be very, very important indeed. And I do think, I also agree with James that the match fitness argument is an important one. I think a lot of the issues, to my mind, a lot of the issues that the government has faced since it took office have been, at least to some degree, as a result of simply not realizing they're in government and understanding the implications of that. And I should say, in the interest of fairness, that I think the opposition, the Conservatives, have suffered greatly from not remembering that they are in opposition and the implications of that. And as time goes on, and people in the various positions on both sides of that argument realise the implications of their new positions, I imagine that we'll see, for want of a better expression, a more coordinated, better organised approach to things. And I think that if the economic situation does improve, I think that is a good position to sell the improved circumstances to the people, and hope that the perceptions improve.
Peter, can I just come in?
Of course.
Can I just come in on that? Joe, I mean, risk of all of us agreeing on everything, you'll have to poke the bear, Peter, and we'll have to find something to disagree on. Look,
Me?
I think if you list the categories that the spending review, whatever government is in, then there's always going to be all human life will have to be considered. But I think the story that the government now needs to tell is around a deliberate concentration on everyday life. Look, with public services that are still in crisis mode or limp mode, and that's going to take some time to turn around. The investment outside of London and the southeast is welcome. We've got now huge investment to transport. That's about getting people to work with effective transport integration. Wages have all gone up. The rights at work from day one will be a feature in due course. Public services, my schools got a big funding boost in Bury North the same week as the announcements on the transport to fix some of the issues that affect our buildings, and per pupil funding will go up. So as all of this begins to come through, this ladder of items, those tentacles will begin to affect the experiences of people in everyday life. But I would just also caveat that this isn't about the kind of, you would say this, but such is the extent to the cleanup job that's required here, is that the funding that's come to schools in Bury North, the example I use, and there were hundreds of other schools and areas also receiving it, was to fix roofs and to do overdue project work in schools, building work in schools. That's going to be quite a hard sell to demonstrate. So we will need to go further and faster and do more.
Okay.
But as a year one start, it's identifying the size of the job and cracking on.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the politics of this, as well as the economic implications and motivations. We've got a great question from Lucilla Regis, who's gone in touch and says,
I've lost you.
Today, the spending review was delivered with at least one eye on Reform UK. A poll today from More in Common, sorry, Joe, and it is just one poll, puts Labour in third place, but of course there have been a number of polls that have done that. Does this mean the spending review failed? And what does Rachel Reeves, if she's still in place in the autumn, need to do in the next budget? Let's ask Joe that first.
Well, the first thing I would say is that the polling now consistently has shown a close situation between Reform, the Conservatives, and Labour. Sometimes Labour ahead, sometimes Reform. It's rare for the Conservatives to be in front, but essentially it's a three-way tie. Does that mean the spending review has failed? It's really too early to tell. You look in polling for turning points and talking points. The spending review was a talking point, but I doubt it will be a turning point in the fortunes of any party. And I think it's worth pointing out that only a quarter of people, when we asked them at Delta Poll, only a quarter of people blamed the current Labour government for the economic situation. And so, to go back to James's point about inheritance of a difficult situation, that does cut through to some extent. The COVID pandemic is seen as more important, and indeed previous Conservative governments are perceived as being more important in determining the current economic situation than the current Labour government. Now that won't last, but it does show that there is some recognition that the work still needs to be done. And as that carries on, I expect that we will see the polls change.
Seamus, what's your perspective on this?
I mean, in terms of the kind of the political angle, I can't say much, but just in terms of kind of public perception more broadly, I think one of the things that one of the tasks that the Chancellor had with the spending review was to ensure stability and confidence in the markets. And certainly I think that has been delivered. The issue with the autumn statement and the unexpected or unanticipated increase in employers' national insurance was that it really startled the horses. Investment nosedived afterward. The business community was up in arms. There was a lot of concern about the future of jobs and whether redundancies would increase, etc., and the impact on wages as well. That was unexpected and I think unwelcome for a new government entering office after a long period on the opposition benches. This time around, okay, it's a spending review. It's a little bit different. But the message from the Chancellor was one of continuity, one of stability, one of confidence, one of sticking to her fiscal rules. And I think also a broadly positive message. There wasn't a huge amount of spending increases, but if you listen to the tone of her speech, it didn't come across that way. It seemed a lot more optimistic. And I think from that point of view, it was a target achieved. On the kind of going back to the previous answers from my fellow panelists, the other thing that I think when you look at sort of what people's perception of this government is and the fact that Joe made about the previous government and other factors being blamed more for the economic situation, the other thing to keep an eye on is the Straits of Hormuz. If there is disruption in that trade route, which produces a quarter of the world's gas supplies and a quarter of the world's oil supplies, that will also provide another external factor that will feature in this. So I think domestically, it seems like Labour they have a very challenging set of circumstances to deal with, but they're at least not at fault for the bulk of them, and that will hopefully, from their point of view, play well with voters.
I want to talk about the global context maybe in a minute or two, but I just wonder from an analyst's perspective, and I'm not asking you to be party political at all here, Seamus, but from an analyst's perspective, how much are you looking at Reform UK's plans? Because of course they are consistently ahead in the polls, as Joe has told us, they are a big threat to Labour. It's not out of the question that Nigel Farage becomes the next Prime Minister. It's unlikely, but we'll see. I just wonder, Seamus, from your perspective, how seriously analysts are looking at those economic plans. Keir Starmer criticises them as £80 billion of unfunded commitments. What do you think?
I mean, look, if you look at British politics over the last 10 years, you'd learn to realise that it's only a fool that would rule out the prospect of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister. Lots of very unexpected things have happened, and I think a number of years ago, nobody would have expected him to be Prime Minister, but it is a very realistic prospect now. I work for a party neutral business organisation. We engage with all parties, and indeed we have started engaging very actively with Reform. It helps that a lot of the agenda, a lot of their voters happen to be in constituencies where a lot of our members in the manufacturing community are based. So they're very much aligned with trying to support our sector, but ensuring that they understand the detail of what it is our members need and that we understand what their objectives are, I think is a two-way conversation. So yes, we're engaging with them quite actively, but we are also engaging with government who have been very positive in their engagement with us around the industrial strategy and indeed with all the other parties too. That's just a natural course of what we do.
Of course, and I should say that Atticus Partners are planning an event like this with Richard Tice. It's not quite nailed down just yet, but we think it will happen. I'll be interviewing him at some stage, so do keep an eye in your inbox and you can sign up for that. He's probably the most likely person to be certainly the main finance spokesman for Reform at the moment. I wonder if he will end up with the title Shadow Chancellor of Reform or Opposition, or even Chancellor. We will see what happens. James Frith, from your perspective, just on this point on Reform UK that Lucilla Regis has looked at here and made this point, how much do you think realistically Rachel Reeves is looking over her shoulder at Reform UK at the moment?
I don't think she's looking over her shoulder at all.
Not at all at the party that's leading the polls?
Not at all. I think the threat that Reform pose should not be ignored. It should be respected. But their I mean, you talk of a plan. They have no obvious plan other than to spout kind of truss economics and start from there and carry on. The unfunded promises, the threshold for income tax, the cuts to local services, as if there's been some golden age in funding to the regions and nations, the baiting of our communities, the divisive rhetoric, the opportunity to ask a prime minister in her first question in the House after a successful by-election win, not cost of living, not the NHS, not defence, and of course we know the position on of reformer Farage, particularly a kind of pro-Putin angle of an admirer of Putin, quote unquote. She instead talks to banning the burqa. This is a party that poses a threat, but has not decided how it deserves or should govern. And so, no, I don't think the Chancellor is looking over her shoulder. The grown-ups are in charge. We've had a decade more of amateur dramatics and kind of hysterics in Downing Street, in the prime ministers of Johnson and Truss particularly, who did untold damage to both the faith in politics and the fabric of our country. And so Rachel, as the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, her job is to set the course for the country. It's to be looking ahead, not looking over her shoulder.
Okay, let's talk more about the external factors. Seamus, maybe I'll start with you on that one, then I'll go to Joe and then James. Just in regard to, I mean, you're hinting there, you're talking a little bit, obviously, there are many, many serious things happening, particularly in the Middle East at the moment that is having an effect already. The price of oil has gone up. So even if you've no interest whatsoever in Iran versus Israel, the American aspect and all the rest of it, the consumer will notice it at the pump. And let's remember, of course, that the vast majority of journeys in this country are done by car. So Seamus, external factors to the spending review are going to be a big thing, aren't they? They are a big thing and will continue to be a big thing.
Absolutely, and they're already a huge factor. I mean, just starting on energy, UK industrial energy costs are typically 4 to 5 times more than what our European or our American competitors pay. So that is a very significant disadvantage we are at, not just in terms of what we produce here ourselves, but also in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, which is another key aspect of trying to grow the economy. That's largely a result of the war in Ukraine. But I think the worrying thing about what's happening in Iran at the moment is that the alternative source for the bulk of British gas after the war in Ukraine came from Qatar. And that is shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. So any disruption there will have a direct impact on gas prices, which not only in and of themselves are expensive, but also determine what the overall energy price we pay in the UK is. So that will be a considerable impact if it is borne out, not just on consumers, but on industry as well. The other factor here is tariffs. The government has taken a very clear-headed, calm and steady approach to Donald Trump in terms of his announcements on tariffs. And thankfully, when they were initially announced, the UK was in a slightly better position vis-a-vis the rest of the world when those tariff rates were introduced. And the Prime Minister has successfully negotiated a deal with the White House for a reduction in those tariffs. But who's to say what might happen over the course of the rest of his presidency in terms of other policies that might not have been expected that could have an effect on us. And it's not just the impact of those tariffs directly, but also because they are imposed on other countries in our supply chain, they will affect us one way or another. So we typically sit in the middle of global supply chains where we import components that are then refabricated and then re-exported. So whatever happens to other countries in our supply chain will also affect us. So there are a number of significant factors going on here. And I think they will all play domestically as well. But obviously energy is the big one right now. Tariffs, I think, has been dealt with calmly, and it's an indication of the government's approach to a lot of these things. There is only so much they can do. And we've talked a lot about the economic and the fiscal side of things, and there's only so much money that can be spent. But there are a number of measures that the government have taken in terms of policy reform, in terms of calm engagement, in terms of trying to negotiate new trade deals with the EU, with India, and there's talk of further deals with Gulf states as well. So they're taking a calm, measured approach, and I think that that's the right one given the circumstances.
Keep your questions coming in. You can put them in the Q&A box and I will ask them to our panelists. I'm going to go to James Frith in a second, but Joe Twyman, just your thoughts on external factors in regard to the fiscal picture that is there, not just what's been announced in the spending review, the growth figures that came afterwards, but things that are, quite frankly, and there's no judgment here, it's just a fact, they're beyond Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves's control, many of these factors.
Yes, and as mentioned, I think there is some recognition in the general public that is the case, particularly with regards to the war in Ukraine, and I'm sure inevitably the situation in the Middle East, as was so eloquently discussed. But I think there's also a recognition that COVID still has an impact on things, whether it's the justice system, whether it's the NHS system, whether it's the schools. If you're involved in these processes, if you understand what's going on, you will inevitably have been exposed to the impacts that COVID has had, and indeed the impacts that COVID continues to have. And so that's the starting position. And then on top of that, you have the situation with Donald Trump, which, regardless of your political position, whether you're for or against the changes that he has made, I think there has to be a recognition that that brings uncertainty to the world and indeed to many world economies. And we know that markets and investors and all these different groups, if there's one thing they don't like, it's uncertainty. And so having to mitigate for this uncertainty, but also the unpredictability of what's coming out of the White House, inevitably makes the situation all the more difficult. And so, while people do recognise that the situation, that external factors affect the situation, I don't think they perhaps recognise the degree to which that will continue to be the case over the next few years.
James Frith, what do you make of the impact of external factors?
Well, I mean, I think he's been among Keir Starmer Prime Minister's finest form in terms of his readiness and abilities on the world stage. He's got out and about very quickly. He's understood the measure of the challenge and cracked on with leadership, both as a sort of post-Brexit agility negotiator between the European Union and Donald Trump, President Trump, and that's borne some fruit. It should not be underestimated, the success of 3 trade deals that have been in the ether until the Labour government landed them and secured them with the right deals as a starter for 10 across EU, India, and the US. Of course, for the US, that means that the tariffs that Trump has issued don't apply to us, as they might have done, as well as then the position that Keir Starmer has put himself in being able to communicate effectively with Donald Trump, as well as drawing together the coalition of the willing the European Union countries and European allies in our position on Ukraine and the continued defense of Ukraine that meant the defense spending we've just been speaking about happened. But look, there is always a situation in politics that events, dear boy, as once was said. I'm also reminded of the boxer's quote that everyone has a plan until I hit them in the mouth. And there is a bit of that in government, that for all the intents and purposes of a manifesto and then a budget and then the government announcements that follow, events will come and hit you in the mouth. And sure enough, there is a lot of world going on away from Westminster that is meaning our Prime Minister particularly, as well as our Foreign Secretary, are having to be attempt to de-escalate rising instincts of conflict. So yeah, there are going to be implications for that, of course. We've probably not yet seen the impact on inflation as it stays steady, but the markets obviously are beginning to respond to the latest attack on Israel, and we will see as to what President Trump's instincts are on dealing with Iran. It should be noted as well, of course, that the Iran nuclear deal was kiboshed by Trump. So, which of course was an agreement for Iran to cease the enrichment of plutonium and their prep for nuclear. So I would think Trump is very keen to ensure that prior decisions he's taken in office don't cost us dearly.
You talked about Harold Macmillan's quote there, "Events, dear boy, events." He then went to Mike Tyson saying that everybody has a plan until they get thumped in the mouth. I want to quote another philosopher, Cheryl Cole. Let's go back to the start in terms of the spending review. What was missing in it, do you think? And will growth actually happen to the degree that it is needed, Seamus?
I'm struck by your grasp of philosophy, Peter. It seems to be surpassed. In terms of what was missing, I think from a business point of view, there's a lot of detail missing in terms of the overall growth objectives and how that will be underpinned. But of course, that's likely because most of those announcements will come in the coming weeks, starting with the industrial strategy, which will set the framework for how the government intends to go about achieving its target of becoming having the fastest and highest sustained growth in the G7. There will be subsequent announcements around specific sector objectives and a skills plan, and I think that will be vitally important. The UK's higher education sector, particularly in England, is currently downsizing, largely off the back of cost-cutting measures that are having to be introduced there. There's significant employer pressure for reform of the apprenticeship levy into Labour's planned growth and skills levy, largely because the money that is raised through that tax cannot be spent in the way employers need to fill the skills gap that are there. And there are significant skills gaps that are really putting a block on domestic growth. Labour are going about introducing an awful lot of planning reform, which will hopefully free up the capacity to build more houses, and that I think will be welcomed by a lot of voters, but also public infrastructure, transport, linking into GB Rail and their objectives there. So there's not an awful lot of money about, and there's very considerable headwinds heading our way, but they are doing a number of measures that can hopefully change the dial when it comes to economic growth and that are relatively cost effective. But of course, as we've talked about throughout this call, there are so many uncertainties that are likely to affect those plans. I can understand why the detail was a little bit sparse on these things in the spending review. Rachel Reeves is walking a very narrow tightrope and playing a very demanding game at the moment. And I think there's very much an eye on those possibilities and trying to contain uncertainty within the market, I think is one of her key priorities. This is very much about calm and steady for the time being, but we will find out more details in the coming weeks about their specific plans for growth.
Got about 10 minutes left, folks. So if you have any questions for the panel, I have plenty more, but I'd much rather ask yours. Do type them in the Q&A box. I just want to ask Joe Twyman just about this growth issue. I don't want to sort of patronize the public, but do people really understand growth? Do they really understand what that means when you throw words at them and talk about gross domestic product? And I just remember working for the BBC previously and being told what words people do understand and don't understand, concepts and economic concepts. When you have political leaders saying we need growth is going to sort out the economy, do people A, know what that is, and B, feel that it will actually sort the economy, that it's the answer?
Well, no, not really. I mean, most people are not au fait with the specifics of GDP and GNP and everything else. But I think what's important is that people perceive growth as a good thing. But there is a danger that growth can be perceived, growth can be presented at the aggregate level, so the national level, and then people see that as not affecting them. And we saw that during the Brexit referendum very clearly. The economic arguments about growth were, time and again in focus groups and in surveys, people would respond, well, the economy may shrink, but that won't affect me because I'm in very difficult circumstances to begin with. Things can't get any worse for me. And so sometimes the general public sees growth as a reflection of the richest in society, rather than them and themselves, rather than them and their households and families. And so it's a bit of a difficult tightrope to walk on exactly how you present that. Having said that, growth and controlling inflation are seen as the two most important priorities for government when it comes to its economic policies generally. So not just the spending review, but all of the things that government does, growing the economy and controlling inflation, are perceived to be the most important things to focus on. And they come well ahead of, for instance, more spending on more public spending. But it's also worth pointing out that a lot of these things are viewed by the public as being interlinked. And so if you're spending more on housing, for instance, yes, there are some people that will object to more houses being built from a perspective of wanting to protect the green belt and not wanting their area to change. But a lot more people are happy for the houses to be built, but are critical of the supporting infrastructure. And so they say, well, what good is building 1,000 new homes here when at the present time you can't get an appointment at the hospital, the waiting lists are very long, the roads are too busy as it is, the schools are oversubscribed, etc., etc. Are we going to get the new schools built? Are we going to get the new hospitals built? Are the roads going to be up to it? And there's a recognition that one of these things individually does not operate in a vacuum. And again, that simply adds difficulty to the government in terms of what they're messaging.
James, I wonder what your perspective on this whole issue is, but just before you go into that, perhaps you could tell me, when you're pounding the streets of Bury North and giving people leaflets and greeting your constituents, and do they say, do you know what, I really think we need to get growth? Is that top of their agenda?
No, but they do understand it. They understand that if there is more, we can do more, and we've got to grow the size of the cake. A bigger cake is more cake for everybody. But in truth, it's improvements to everyday life, and it will matter not a jot if at the next election we can talk up the GDP figures, but the GP numbers aren't good enough, or that if the accessing everyday life public experiences, public sector, public service experiences, I should say, like school buildings, per pupil funding, the health or the wait time for health appointments, the surgery time, wait times, the state of our roads. Actually, I signed a letter recently to the Chancellor asking for specific funding to be given to improve, if you like, the kind of window boxes of our towns, because there is a need to restore some pride in some of the towns and regions that we live in, such as the demise of some of our infrastructure, but also what it looks like, the state of our roads. And I think that's an important point. So it is about change. That was, of course, the one-word slogan that Labour went into the election asking to be the government of the day. But it's about improvements to everyday life that really matters. And if you can point to those or signal they're incoming, that's the thing that people care about. And of course, there's a great range of different priorities for people in the streets. A town like Bury, we've a great number of problems and opportunities, but we've also a great distinction as one of the greater Manchester boroughs. The point that Joe was making about the housing, it is a contentious issue locally. There are those, many of whom are in homes that I defended as a councillor as needing to be built, saying that new homes shouldn't be built. And we've got to have those arguments with them, and we've got to make the case for it. But I'm delighted that the government's put money where infrastructure needs to be, i.e. the new tram stop in Bury as one example, as well as then investment in some of the public services that I've spoken to. So yes, it will need to come off the back of growth, but people's interpretation of what growth means is very much, have things got better for me?
Of course, we've just got 5 minutes left. If anybody has any last minute questions, fire them through. One thing I'd like to ask all three members of the panel on, maybe starting actually with James, is just in regard to what Sadiq Khan has said. Other leaders in London have expressed disappointment, the lack of funding. We've had police leaders talking about the police not having enough money, although they have, of course, had an uplift. Transport projects in the capital city being a big issue as well. I just wonder, James, how do you think the government is trying to balance investment in London versus the regions? It's a long time since I've heard anybody say the words levelling up, I must say.
Well, look, the Mayor of London understands his brief. That is to be the champion of London. But the government has to take a perspective across the country, and there is an assessment that we need to do much more in the nations and regions outside of London and the Southeast, particularly. That is an argument that was begun with the term levelling up. That assessment, that analysis of why levelling up was needed is still bang on. That was never an issue of contention for us as a Labour Party. And so there have been some fiscal and monetary and budgetary changes to that as a result, but there's also been slightly more nerdier but nevertheless important technical tweaks, which is about the weighting given by Treasury officials as to money spent outside of the capital. The Green Book changes and the reform to those changes will mean that investment in towns and projects outside of London and the Southeast don't have to work doubly hard to get appreciation or evaluation, and that actually investment and infrastructure spend, project spend outside of the capital is seen as important, as just as important as the work that's been done in London.
Seamus, what's your perspective on this, on sort of London versus the regions?
Well, I think just on Sadiq Khan's statements, obviously, I think that's actually something that probably plays well for both sides of the Labour Party. It plays well in London in terms of his own supporters, but also it reinforces to the rest of the country that actually London is not getting everything that it wants from government, and this government is looking to redirect funding elsewhere. I think more broadly, the Labour government have talked a lot, and they've done a certain amount so far in terms of regional and devolution. City mayors, and Andy Burnham in Manchester in particular has risen to prominence quite considerably, showing what a local mayor can do. And there's been a number of powers that are being granted to local mayors, particularly around something like, for example, local infrastructure and local transport networks that will allow for regional economies to grow. The Council of the Nations and Regions, bringing together the leaders of the devolved administrations with the city mayors and with the central government, I think is another step towards better coordination across the UK while enabling local consideration. So there are a number of changes to the machinery of government going on behind the scenes, which might not be the kind of sexy stuff that voters get excited about. But as any senior business figure or any executives on this call will understand, structures and culture are absolutely vital to how your organization functions. And I think that certainly behind the scenes, there are a number of steps being taken that suggest that this is a government that is looking to level up, even if they're not necessarily using the language, but also putting steps in place to enable that to happen.
Just very briefly, Joe Twyman, I just want to keep us on time. Just in 30 to 45 seconds, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I think the relationship between London and the rest of the UK is something that Labour needs to be cognizant of, and I think in defence of the government they are. But I think also they need to be aware of the distinction between cities generally and towns and more rural areas. And so it's not just London versus the UK; it's metropolitan England versus the rest of England versus Scotland versus Wales. That makes it sound adversarial, but I think it is an issue. And Northern Ireland as well, of course.
Thank you all very, very much indeed to James Frith MP, to Dr. Seamus Nevin from MEC UK, for Joe Twyman from Delta Pool. I've been Peter Cardwell, still am, of Talk. Thank you so much to everybody who's taken part and indeed organised this Atticus Partners event. We'll see you for another one again very soon.
Thank you all.